Okay, everyone, welcome to Bay and Coastal Flooding. We're going to get started and start our session. I'm Greg Dalton, the host of Climate One TV show here in the Bay Area and also Climate One Radio in the Bay Area, increasingly around the country. I'll be the moderator convener for today. And in my day job, I get people together to have conversations across disciplines and silos and get people who don't know each other or are a little bit uncomfortable with each other. So I'm really happy to be here with CRI doing some deep convening and connecting. We have, as you heard earlier, we have 3 parts today. We'll have some framing presentations by 4 experts. Then we'll break out to our tables, and then we'll come back for a large discussion, and we'll have a graphic recorder over there who'll be capturing our ideas, and then doing that. So we're going to have 4 speakers. Jeremy Lowe's going to come up first and just put a couple of framing slides, and then he's going to come back again. But Jeremy is the coastal geomorphologist at Environmental Science Associates. He has more than 25 years of experience in tidal wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation planning in the Pacific Coast. He's helped both Venice, Italy, and Venice, California with some of their planning and adaptation. So Jeremy, please come up.
Well, thank you. And geo is the earth, morphology is the shape, and sea level is what's going to change it. And this is an example of the problem we're actually facing. The squiggly line, the black squiggly line at the bottom is simply mean sea level recorded over 100 years at the Presidio. The dotted orange line is increasing sea level projection. That's one from the OPC in 2011. Gives you 55 inches by 2100. The real problem we have with flooding, though, are those black crosses. The black crosses are the maximum monthly recorded water levels at the Presidio, and you can see they're a lot higher. We can calculate recurrence intervals from those, a 100-year return period, something that might happen there's a 1% chance of it happening every year. Those are what we design our flood defenses for, and I've drawn a little flood defense at the back, that orange trapezoid at the back. Right. When we look at it going forward, we add sea level rise to those recurrence intervals, and you can see those recurrence intervals are changing. The 100-year water level is going to increase in elevation. If we build our level of our crest of our levee at a certain elevation, what is a 100-year protection today, in the year 2000 or so, will become a 20-year protection by 2033, will become a 2-year protection later on in the century. So if we leave everything static and we just let the sea level rise, what happens is our risk increases. The likelihood of flooding occurs increases, and the depth that we will get behind those structures when they fail, if they fail, will increase. So our risk increases. The second point is we have lots of projections. We have projections every year that come out. These are the 2 from the NRC 2012. The orange one is the high projection. What does that mean? Well, it was the highest one they chose to choose. The mid. What does that mean? Well, that was the mid one. So we have, if you look at what happens in 2100, you get a 36-inch sea level rise, which is about up to my waist, or you get 55, which is up to my neck. So what do we choose? Well, it depends. But if you look at it another way, when you say, well, what happens, when do we reach 36 inches? Well, those both projections will get there between about 2070 and 2100. There's only about 30-year difference. What about getting to 65 inches? Again, it's about a 30 or 40-year difference. When you compare that with the life of a major piece of infrastructure, then we should be designing things, if they're going to be around in about the end of the century, to at least 36 inches. If they're going to be at the mid-century, then we should be at 65. We should think about elevation more than actual year, and I think that's how we're going to fit things, our adaptations for our infrastructure much more rapidly.
Thanks, Jeremy. Next up, we have Zach Wasserman, who's chair of the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. He was formerly on the Oakland Board of Commissioners, the Oakland Port Board of Commissioners, and he played an integral role in negotiating with BCDC on the Bay Plan Amendment to address sea level rise. Welcome, Zach.
Good morning, all. It's still morning. In the tradition we had this morning, I apologize, I do not have any connection to UC Davis. I did attend Stanford Law School. I did spend 2 quarters on the Cal campus getting grades because I was at UC Santa Cruz. And that's in the very early years when there was only pass-fail. And that's actually relevant because, as you may know, The mascot for UC Santa Cruz is the banana slug. So I'm used to things moving slowly. And that's what we're talking about here. One of the industry people we brought into a series of roundtables at BCDC has talked about this as a slow-moving emergency. And I really think that's what it is. And the difficulty, of course, is when you have an emergency that it's slow-moving, it's very difficult to get people to react to it. And I think that although Mike McCarthy this morning made some comparisons to the drought, and I appreciate that there can be some useful comparisons when he got people to raise their hands on whether they had done anything professionally or personally regarding the drought, it's pretty easy to do something about the drought. You can reduce the flow in your toilet. You can take fewer or shorter, or both, showers. There are things we can do. Very, very difficult to address these kinds of things individually, but that's what we've got to start figuring out, not truly individually, but collectively. I very much like Jeremy's remarks. I would turn them a little bit or rephrase them a little bit, and I give credit to John Englander, the author of High Tide on Main Street, who was in town at a number of events this week. If you haven't seen him and have the chance to, you should. We know that sometime between 2050 and 2100, sea level is going to rise 3 feet. We don't know when exactly. We know it's not going to stop there. And we also know that as much as we do, and we do need to do lots more, on mitigation, on trying to reduce GHG, sea level is going to rise. If we solve GHG tomorrow, if we got zero emissions tomorrow, we know these figures wouldn't change. So when people talk about adaptation and mitigation, I don't disagree with that. I do agree with it. But I'm not an expert, with all due respect. I am a passionate amateur. And I think what we really need to focus on in many, many ways is how we're going to adapt, how we're going to become resilient to the absolute fact shown by those slides. Where do we need to focus? Well, lots of places. We know that this is going to have a dramatic effect on some of our major institutions, our airports, their runways, on some of our major highways, on some of our low-lying power plants, on BART, frankly, because 3 feet rise in the bay and king tides will mean that the Embarcadero station is flooded probably as often as not. May not be underwater all the time. So all of those are real issues. And what I have talked about at BCDC is a campaign. And I've described it as a 5 to 10 year campaign. We're probably about 2 years into it. If I took from when Will Travis started this, we would be much farther into it, but we have to balance things. We're about 2 years into this campaign. And the campaign is to determine, as best we can, what are the things we're going to be able to adapt. And it's going to be a range of things. In simplest terms, some of it's going to be seawalls. There are places where we're going to need seawalls. And there are places where we're building them right now, and we should be. There are places where marsh restoration and extension will work. There are going to be places that we're probably going to have to abandon. Not tomorrow, not quickly, but we're going to recognize we can't protect it all. Second, we're going to have to decide with those areas. Oh, I'm sorry, I left out one of the most important part. I think there are going to be remedies, methods of adaptation that we have no idea about today. We all are carrying smartphones. I don't think that will help us adapt to rising sea level. But it has changed the way we communicate and what we do. I think there will be things, and I encourage you to go to the BCDC site. Will and BCDC staff sponsored a design competition now about 6 years ago with proposals from all over the world on how we might adapt. And some of them are crazy, and some of them are not so crazy. You may have seen in the Chronicle the Goldilocks proposal for the sort of inflatable locks at the Golden Gate. That in part comes out of that. So that's a piece to technological changes. Second, given what we can know about unintended consequences and priorities, what should we do amongst those possibilities? And the third one, the really big tough one, is how are we going to finance it? We don't need to decide that now, but we certainly need to start thinking about all of these things. I think this, today, this summit, the concept of CRI is terrific for several reasons. One, I think if we can truly engender and make effective cooperation between these three academic institutions, that alone will be a very significant impact on what we're doing. As you saw, although you probably couldn't read it, the slide that Bruce showed of Joe Leclerc's writing, there's a much snazzier one now, and we'll get to the point where we release it. But there are many, many, many initiatives out there, and the current version looks like bursting flowers. Getting coordination amongst those is a very important part of succeeding in this collective effort and in our campaign. So I welcome this. The second piece that I think is wonderful, and several of the speakers this morning talked about it, is studying still needs to be done. We're not done studying. But studying is not enough. We need to turn the studies into action. And we need to figure out how to do that cooperatively, collectively, as efficiently as we can. So these kinds of collaborations are critical in leading us forward in that campaign, in helping us figure out what we're really going to be able to do to adapt in a resilient way to the reality that's shown on those graphs. So I welcome your effort, and I thank you very much.
Within 7 seconds, that's pretty good timing, Zach. Thank you. John Largier is a professor of coastal oceanography at the University of California, Davis, and a resident at the Bodega Marine Laboratory. His research focuses on transport in ocean, bay, nearshore, and estuarine waters. Please come on up, John.
So resisted the temptation of PowerPoint slides and detailed discussion. Rather choose 3 points which are meant to be broad and hopefully more fundamental, maybe somewhat philosophical. They sort of seem obvious, but it's trying to disaggregate the problem a little bit. And coming out of it is really sort of an agenda for the knowledge business, which kind of follows on from what Zach said. Studies alone are not much use. Where do we need the knowledge and how does it play out? The 3 points are coastal and bay flooding has many faces. It's not one amorphous thing. The second is that we need to quantify in order to prioritize. And the third is we need to get ahead of the game, because the sooner we realize what we need to do, the easier the transition is. So they're really all pretty obvious points, probably. So the first is there are many dimensions of flooding. Flooding is a natural phenomenon. Just like wildfires, we need it to happen. It has benefits, and it has negative impacts. So we need to mitigate the negative and sort of enhance the positive. The strange thing is that the flood defenses get built by floods. The floods are useful important for habitat, for juvenile salmonids, etc. So what kind of flooding is there? Well, there's flooding due to the slow rise of sea level. There's flooding due to fluvial flooding, rivers coming down. There's flooding on the open coast due to the beach dam that closes and floods Pescadero and Russian River. And they all combine and give you statistics like Jeremy showed. So each issue is a little bit different. It's not just one big issue. We can all pick imagine our own sort of sea level rise flooding issue. It might be in South Bay. How high should we build the levees? It might be in the Delta. The levees might break and destroy our water system for the state. It might be a little coastal community. I mentioned places like Pescadero, just a few hundred people, but they're struggling with flooding and fish kills and all sorts of things, or the Russian River and water supply for Sonoma County. Has many different faces. And then there's the open coast, cliff erosion issue. One flooding event in Venice, Italy, just makes San Marcos Square wet and hopefully goes away again. One flooding event with waves behind it eroding the cliff in Southern California throws a few houses in the ocean, and it's not as reversible, or is it? We need to look in the details of in the profiles of these. So that leads to the second point, which is quantify. And quantify is quantifying probability and risk. But it's not risk assessment is essentially two things, the probability of exposure and the dose response. But that's when you're talking about a population of 1 million people. We sort of have n equals 1. So you really can't do it in that way. Maybe you can do it in an insurance way, where the risk of flooding is aggregated with the risk of something else somewhere else. But those risk structures are so difficult. So I don't actually know how we do the risk assessment. I can theorize about it, but how does it get implemented? So what's driving this is that if we want people to spend money, we want ourselves to spend money, we better have hard numbers. We need to make a really strong case. And that's going to be the probability of this loss of value, capital, natural capital, infrastructure, loss of life or whatever is so much. And the cost of it is so much. So you trade off incremental cost versus incremental risk. That's what we have to do. And I don't think as academics we're doing that yet. There is uncertainty, and as I say, it's probability, it's not deterministic, but we have to do that. How do you do it? Well, you do two things. One is you monitor. We need more data. You've heard that before, but we really do. The flooding, if there's a south wind blowing, the north part of the bay will be a foot higher than the south part of the bay, or maybe even more than that. So when you have the high sea level, is there likely to be a south wind blowing or north wind blowing? We don't have those data as much as we could have them, and it's not necessarily even expensive data. We need to get more of it. And the second, so that really is detecting change and figuring out how to address it. And then the second, of course, is modeling. Well, when we get this change, what do we project is going to be the response? So we've done great modeling as best as we can on global circulation and the drivers of climate change. As we get down to smaller scales, it's, I guess the whole world's not working at it because each community is dealing with its own problem. So the challenge, I think, of this quantifying is how do we quantify in a sort of a cost-effective way? We can't study every little problem in detail, so we have to really come up with some protocols, I think, for quantifying risk and probability of certain things happening. And so that really gets to understanding the dynamics and the classes of dynamics. And then the third one is getting ahead of the game. And I think the primary thing there for me is recognizing that it's a system we're dealing with. What we want to avoid is emergency responses. As soon as we have an emergency response, for sure the ecosystem loses out, and many things lose out, not only ecosystem, but certain human things lose out to other certain things. Loss of life trumps everything, and suddenly infrastructure becomes unimportant because we're trying to save lives. If we think ahead of the game, what we're really trying to do is transition. Whether it be the ecosystem or the economic system, it's changing. So we're not holding a line, we're trying to manage a transition over the next century. So if we can get to the point where we're recognizing that's the game, then we can start angling towards that rather than being responsive. And the second part, which I've really sort of mentioned, is the interactions. There are many responses to flooding we have now which do a number on the ecosystem and actually sometimes do a number on the local economic system as well. So resilience is what we're looking for, and the worst way to make things non-resilient is to keep hitting them with a hammer with the emergency responses. So let's think of it as a system. Thanks.
Grant Ballard is Chief Science Officer at Point Blue Conservation Science, and he's a co-PI on Our Coast, Our Future, which is creating an online mapping tool to fill the gap between scientific knowledge and what decision makers need to plan policy. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm standing in for Ellie Cohen, who's our Executive Director at Point Blue. She has the flu, so she asked me to make some remarks, and I'm happy to do that. So 3 things, I was asked to come up with sort of 3 framing points around flooding and sea level rise and risk to or protecting our shorelines. And the 3 things that sort of resonate for me are 1, nature-based solutions, 2, thinking about extreme events, and 3, really starting to use scenario planning. So nature-based solutions, extreme events, and scenario planning. And they all tie into a lot of the comments that my co-panelists have made and remarks that were made earlier. So I'll just quickly go over the way I see them. Nature-based solutions really comes back to this idea that David talked about, also Jim Wunderman talked about this morning. People are essentially unaware of the extent that they rely, to which they rely on the ecosystem and the biosphere. And we have to reconnect humanity with nature. And that has a lot of implications. But basically, our resilience depends on functioning ecosystems and on the physical environment. And San Francisco Bay is an amazing place to live, in part because it is blessed with a lot of gifts that don't exist everywhere. I grew up in the Virgin Islands. Every 10 or 15 years, our entire economy and ecosystems are set back maybe 15 years, so we're kind of staying in the same place because of hurricanes. Hurricanes are coming. They are, I said a few years ago there's going to be a major hurricane in Manhattan within a couple of years, and it happened that year. And I was just, I didn't realize, but when I first went to Manhattan, I was like, what happens if a hurricane comes here? It's going to be crazy, And same thing goes for us. We have to start. Have you ever heard the phrase, plan for the worst, hope for the best? Or hope for the best, plan for the worst. It's something that people in outdoor sports like mountaineering and stuff say, that kind of thing, and then they're packing their bag, like bring the extra pair of socks, more food than you think you need, that kind of stuff. Those are the kinds of things we have to start thinking about. So we basically have a lot to learn about having a lighter touch on the ecosystem and trying to work with ecosystems using tidal marshes, for example, flood protection for vital infrastructure and dune ecosystems and that sort of thing. So the second thing ties in directly, obviously, extreme events. And I just mentioned hurricanes. Basically, we need a plan for what happens when superstorm whatever hits the bay, or earthquake plus a few other things happen. It's going to happen. What's our vision? And do we have a collective vision of how we're going to deal with that? In the absence of that, lots of things that we don't want to happen will happen. So we have to build that vision. And those extreme events can change everything. And I have experience working in Antarctica where glaciers are disappearing faster than most people realize. And we're sort of hemming and hawing scientifically about what the effect on sea level rise will be. There are 5-meter sea level rise projections for 2100 that I find credible. And we're not really even talking about them because it's too scary. It's too out there for most of us to even consider what that would be like. But what I see happening is that kind of change. There are places in Antarctica where systems have been stable for a few thousand years. There are places in Antarctica that are completely unstable. And the difference in the terms of what populations of animals are able to exist there are mind-boggling. So the third thing is scenario planning, which ties directly into this. We need to find a way to interact with each other, cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary conversations where we are actually talking about the what if this happens, what if that happens, and not worrying about we don't know what's going to happen, but saying these are things that could happen. What if that is what comes to pass? And there's a whole pretty well developed sort of discipline around dealing in that scenario planning world towards decision making, actually taking action, making change happen now. And as one of you said, we have to act now. We know from our analyses that the worst thing you can do is to not take any action. And what we're hearing every day, I was just doing a presentation to the Coastal Commission with Marina, who's here, with Our Coast, Our Future, and they had been hearing about Our Coast, Our Future, and they were sort of overwhelmed by, it sounds like there's too many scenarios in there, and what do we do with all this information, or how could we possibly take any action using this? It's too difficult. What they needed is some hand-holding and some conversation directly and saying, for us, asking them, what is it that you have to make a decision about today? What are you working on? Let's use this tool to sort of reduce the uncertainty, to frame it, and say, here are the what-ifs. Okay, so that's all I've got. Thank you.
Okay, so I can't resist the idea of showing pictures as well, because this is a great picture. This is showing Highway 101 at Sausalito underwater in 2030. I've got a special camera here, and it's illustrating the point that we're going to get in areas already know we're going to get flooding. Actually, you can go and do this on a king tide and have a look at the website. But what we need to do I think the great idea from this institute is to collect together this knowledge that Bill Collins was talking about we understand about climate change projections, we understand about what might happen to the sea level, we got precipitation, so we can think about what the rivers are going to be doing. I know there's a lot of work done on vertical land motion. We can start getting a really good picture about what the natural system is going to be doing and what we're going to be facing in terms of adaptation. We have a really good idea about what we're doing. There's some really good CEC studies from Berkeley about the impact of sea level rise on transportation, and looking about the impacts on the highway system and where the weakest link is. Where are we going to find those problem areas first off? Because those are the areas, if we're going to identify those specific geographical areas, we can tie them into what we're doing in terms of wetland restoration, in terms of what we're doing in other developments, and looking for those co-benefits. If we're doing adaptation in those areas for transportation, we could get some other benefits for other areas as well. So I'm thinking that one thing we need to do is recalibrate how we understand our bay working, where we're going to accept risk, how we're going to manage it, and look for co-benefits, look for capital improvement plans where people are going to build a new structure, a new highway, and start incorporating those types of thinking into it to look for raising money for financing. Because one thing we're going to have to start doing is reinventing how we manage the bay, reinventing how we're using the wetlands, we're using the sediment that we have, using the wastewater effluents, using all those resources that previously we've sort of been putting into channels or into tunnels or into pipes and so on. Because what we're really thinking about is a bay which we haven't seen before, a bay which is going to be responding to rapid sea level rise. And one thing we know about our bay is it's got a lot of holes in it. We diked a lot of those areas behind levees, and we've allowed them to subside, and we've created holes which are going to could be filled with water. At the moment, they're filled with people and houses and so on. But what we also need to do is prioritize which one of those need filling. And we've got to start to think about where do we need to put things. Now, one industry that we have is the dredging industry. The dredging industry is designed to build big holes really quickly and move that material somewhere else. That's how they make their money. Maybe we should think about the placing industry instead. Maybe we should be thinking about how nature actually builds up its wetlands as a natural defender for sea level rise, and think about we're doing things a little and often. Another question we have, one way to do that is this photograph, which is actually called rainbowing. It's firing mud into the air and hoping it lands on the mudflat somewhere. One lesson learned from this, do not stand downwind of it. Okay. Because then the question is, how do you get this mud from the dredger, from where the navigation channel and so on, back up onto the mudflat? That's a mile away across a very shallow, sloppy marsh, mudflat with endangered species on it. If somebody can, and I know it's not rocket science, it's not particularly sexy, but if somebody can figure out in Berkeley or Stanford how to get mud from A to B without getting through C and D, you'll be hopefully in some big money, because that may be part of the future. Thinking about the water, the sediment quality, is the mud good enough? Are there other materials we could use? Keep getting phoned up. Can we use biosolids? I don't know. And then just basically putting mud in the bay. Is it legal? Well, not in all places. And so we've got to start thinking about how we're managing it. So there's a whole series of different disciplines required in these areas, which we were reinventing. Part of that reinvention is pilot projects. We've got to start doing experiments in the bay. We have some experiments thinking about using wastewater down at Oroloma. We're just going to start breaking ground on that in August. There's lots of other opportunities. Experimentation in the bay. That may be something we can move forward, because we can build upon our existing understanding of wetland restoration, but we need to think about this new bay. And the third one is that it always comes up as the, well, at the end when you see the graph and it goes almost vertical at the end, and you see sea level rise going on, and you read a paper which says 2200, this is the projection, 2300. I read a paper yesterday, it said 2,000 years from now, the sea level rise will still be rising because of the warmth we already had in the system. What do we do about retreat? How do you move a neighborhood? How do you move a city? How do you move anything? This photo is the first photographic evidence I found of movement of a community in America. This is from Rhineland, Missouri. And I was really impressed. They'd moved their whole city because of flooding. And then I read how many people lived in the city. They had 120 houses. They spent a huge amount of money. There was a big debate. There was a big question. But this was for a small community. I don't know how you would translate this to Foster City, to other cities around the Bay. How do you move these people? Why would you move them? Why would you move them? Because you ran out of ideas, because you thought that was a good idea for the natural system, because of to keep it moving? Where do you move them to? When do you move? What is the cost? All these questions. And then when you think about it, when you move a city, and we found that from the BRAC realignment of the bases, there's a lot left behind. We've not just modified the surface, we've modified underneath, we've left things behind. Can you make a salt marsh out of an older neighborhood area? Who decides? What's the decision-making process? We have no precedent for this. And then what happens if people said no? What's the alternative? I mean, these are big sociological, philosophical, political questions which geomorphologists don't get into. But I think that's another piece that we should be thinking a long term ahead, because this is a big question which I don't think we have any concept at the moment about how to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Speaking of moving, one of the guests I hope to have at Climate One later this year is President Nasheed from the Maldives, who's talking about moving a whole country, not just a small neighborhood, a big task. Now we will move to the table discussion. 30 minutes. We'll ask each of the panelists to join one of, looks like we got 4 tables. Maybe the outliers can consolidate. And the task is to answer the question, how can CRI advance solutions to the challenges we've just heard? What are some of the top ideas that NGOs and different sectors can do? Each of you has a sheet to write down your suggestion. That's what you can write down your ideas. We're asking each table to self-select one moderator recorder who will then represent and report out the table's best 2 or 3 ideas. I'll go around after the 30 minutes and ask each table to say what you agreed were your best 2 or 3 solutions for CRI. And then we'll do that for the next 30 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion about all those ideas. So let's do that. And I'll join one of the tables too. if you could, if I could ask the panelists to come back up front, we're going to go to our next session so we can get on to lunch. So could I ask Grant and Jeremy and Zach and John to come on back? Oh, we could take this slide down if that, yeah. Is that right? Sure. And then you're going to get your, I guess we'll do it here. There you go. All right. And then we want you to get your mics on. One more. Who are we missing? Where's John? There he is. Got your mics on there, guys? Okay, so we're going to go around. We have about 20 minutes or so before lunch, and we're going to go around and ask each table to report out on your top 2 or 3 solutions that CRI can address, and also want to remind each person that we'd like to collect from you your own notes and your own suggestions. So this is your homework. Bruce wants to collect these, so if you didn't fill these out, please jot down your own solutions, even if they're not in the top 2 or 3, because we're going to collect those from the facilitators. So let's go to this table here and hear your top 2 or 3 solutions for CRI. Fabulous.
Portable.
Oh, you got it? Perfect. Here.
I'm scared. My kids are gone from home, so haven't had to use that for a while. It's on. Good. Thank you. Oh, great. So we came up with 3 different topics. One of them is integration of watershed, ocean, and groundwater modeling, and that CRI, a role for CRI is to vet the models. There's always competition in academia about which model is best and blah, blah, blah. But policymakers need to be able to make a choice and move ahead. So that would be a role for CRI. So I don't know who at the table wants to talk about that a little bit more in more depth.
Good enough.
You think it's good enough? Okay. The next one is reversible experiments. Christine, do you want to say something?
I just thought that CRI could help because most of us on the academic side know how to design an experiment. And the question would be what information would come out of those that could influence scenario development or the range of alternatives being considered.
And then the third that we came up with was scenario development, so that to communicate to people basically what it could look like in the future under various possible scenarios, which would help hopefully motivate people. And Lisa, do you want to talk more about that?
I think you hit it, just having something that people can get their minds around that really utilize the best science, but start to create a smaller number of scenarios that could be used to stimulate conversation, motivation, and thinking about adaptation measures.
Thank you for that table. Yep, okay. I want to hand off to this table here, and we'll hear theirs.
Right, just for a second, let's just make sure Lou got those 3. We just want to do a quick check. Integration modeling. Yep. Right? Yeah. The reversible experiment? Yes, okay. And scenario development? Yes. Good, thank you.
Okay, so if anyone from my team wants to grab the mic from me and correct me, feel free. So let's see, the first one would be a comprehensive evaluation of the effectiveness of proposed adaptation activities around the Bay. And we could create, if there could be a creation of some sort of systems approach for the Bay that would result in a tool that would be in the public domain with the idea that it'd be for public use, so it wouldn't just sit on the shelf. Second of all, Will, do you want to grab the mic? Secondly, working with the universities that we have at the table to use their own facilities on the coast as prototypes for different adaptation designs and letting that be an example. And then thirdly, studying the implications of potential, for example, geoengineering solutions for the Bay Area, and then comparing that to some of the more traditional or the currently proposed solutions. I'll try and grasp this. Not coming at it with any pro or con, but more traditional, like academic, objective analysis, just so that there can be more informed decisions made down the line. Oh, right. So yeah, damming the entrance to the bay would be an example of that. Yeah, and looking at the implications of that down the line, as opposed to just creating solutions around the coast. Did I miss anything else you guys want to be sure I? Oh, right. And then looking at or planning for a 3 feet sea level rise scenario, rather than focusing on exact science and where it's going to be at what year, just kind of picking a mark and embedding that into all planning documents and translating that into what does this mean for our communities and the public, and then also working on a public messaging campaign so that the public can really see in their communities what will the effects of sea level rise be. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go to the table in the back.
Let's see here. We definitely had a more applied bent, and actually we weren't too specific to tidal flooding, really, but there are two main ones. The first is related to the period, what can CRI do to prepare us for responding to the inevitable climate-driven emergencies in a different way? And what we said was to identify mechanisms that resist getting people back to normal, but rather prepare them for the new normal through the use of legal and policy tools such as eminent domain. It's really a new framework for post-disaster response, and so that we can deal with the infrastructure changes that are going to be required. And the example was used of there was really a need after the Oakland fire to improve the transportation infrastructure in order to prevent the next Oakland fire. But instead, we just immediately stamped building permits for houses that were 50% bigger than the ones that were there to begin with. So that was one identity. The other issue that we identified was for CRI to accept as a role for itself to deal with the problem that we're not adequately translating, and we use that word, available science to support decision making. And that CRI needs to, the brain trust at CRI needs to think about what are the most important results that need to be translated, and then deliver those in a manner that the public and elected officials can really use. And this requires creating incentives at the CRI institutions for this to be a job of the academic world, which it is in some places it is with the groups that have the extension services in them, but that's not normally the case. There are some models about, for example, the NOAA's RESAs, and that this really also requires the co-production of knowledge by the social scientists and the physical scientists working together. And we also concluded that this has an implication for the governance of CRI. So that if CRI is going to really successfully think in this new way, that the governance must be beyond just the universities themselves. And I know that that's kind of what you guys are thinking, but that we think that that's very fundamental for getting the incentive structure in place to fulfill this translation function that your group just referred to. And then very briefly, we also talked about giving engineers the science tools to hit moving targets. And how do you build in reevaluation of projects during their useful lifetime? And we were, our group was and some people could talk to David too about this, but the idea of not giving our community a specific design sea level height to build to by a particular date. That's a too simple an answer for what's going to be a complex problem. And then the challenge, of course, is communicating the more complex version, which we may or may not be able to do. So that's what we had.
Thanks, Andy. Let's have this table here.
Well, thank you, Andy. So we have, our group came up with actually 13 ideas, but
Was there an editor at your table?
there was no editor. That was the problem, yeah. So there may be some overlap with others, but one of our key ones was what I'm terming a communication construct, and it's maybe something along the lines of what Andy's talking about. But, and Larry was talking about, you know, you can't communicate what's going to happen over the long haul to people. It's just too much to absorb. And you're talking about, you know, Antarctica and a 5-meter rise. It's just, you know, your brain sizzles. So you got to break this thing down, chunk it out into some logical time frames where you can kind of grasp it, develop a message in that time frame, communicate it out to everybody, the public, the land use authorities, the researchers, and to really get the understanding that everybody needs so we can approach this thing and deal with it. So the concept is to break it down into smaller time chunks that we can handle as a human experience. The other one is, so the second one is sediment management. And so I guess the first one, the role for CRI, maybe we do need CSI on this, but the role for CRI would be to try and define what these time chunks would be and what what we're going to deal with in terms of messaging and projects in those time chunks. The second one is sediment management, and we've all talked about the bay wetlands needing to accrete to adapt to sea level rise. We already have dredging operations in an industry. Jeremy was talking about this earlier. And really need to look at how that industry works, how we can make it do what we need to do and maybe change our objective to, instead of dredging out a channel below the water surface, the objective might be to improve the wetlands. And how do we achieve that objective and with our dredging industry and operations? And the contracting side of things on, as Larry mentioned, because they deal with this a lot, at least it comes before their board, the contracting process with the Corps is, what did you say, Larry? It was antediluvian. So archaic, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other terms you can use when it comes to talking about that. So that's the kind of the sediment management. And the other thing that we talked about with regards to sediment management is how to tell the story. Again, you know, we got to think about how we're going to communicate this stuff out. And Larry was talking about a recent board meeting where they were reviewing sand mining, and there was like 15 PhDs there, and they're all very articulate, very knowledgeable, but they're all working on a small slice of the pie. So there was no one person there that could talk about the entire pie. So one role for CRI in this sediment management conundrum is to maybe bring those scientific community together with all these little slices of the pie and be able to really tell the full story with sediment management.
Okay, how about if we have a few minutes before lunch, we want to get the panelists back in on this. And then, thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask the panelists to respond. There was one area where tables had very different views. One table was pick 3 feet, pick a number, stick with it. It'll get things moving. It may be too low, but it'll stop the debate about this much. Another table had a very different view. That's simplistic. We'd like to tackle that, whether we had to pick a bold number. Sure.
From the CRI point of view, I don't think CRI should pick a number. I think CRI should have people working on immediate issues, which is maybe more communication, maybe flood proofing, things like that. And so they should be thinking about, I don't know, a little bit of sea level rise. And then there should be other people thinking really long term. That's what universities do really well. And thinking about what those bigger situations. So I think you should be looking at all levels. I don't think you should be worried about what actually has been implemented or discussed at the policy level. I think you should be preparing for all the different stages.
And Grant slipped in a little thing in his remarks about 5 meters of sea level rise being credible by 5100. That was way beyond the charts we looked at.
Yeah. Well, I just think that, well, I would make a prediction that one of the pitfalls of CRI that's going to have to avoid is getting into more arguing and debate about which model is the best model. So do everything you can to avoid that, because scientists will do it. If they're given a chance, they'll do it, and we love to do it, and it's a lot of intellectual fun, but it causes so much confusion among the actual managers and natural resource managers that it's really, really dangerous.
John?
So I was at the table and said, pick 3 feet. You can pick any number. 3 feet we know is going to happen. When it happens is a debate which we don't almost want to get into for exactly what Grant is saying. Pick 3 feet and sketch it out and show how bad it is and how it would be if you did action 1 or 2 or 3. And so, it's to kind of to sort of sell the severity of climate change. You have to sketch it out and sketch out all implications. And that's sort of the point I was trying to make in my comments, is that you're applying pressure through sea level rise, and it applies stresses in all sorts of ways into the system. And I don't think we're even thinking about the ways it's going to play out, or if we do action 1, how that's going to whatever the word is, propagate into other issues. And then really, as part of that, we sort of jumped into one wild action is, put a tidal barrage, as it's called, basically a Thames barrier or a Wadden Sea barrier or something at Golden Gate, which was a fun discussion, and a number of us thought we sort of got to do that to establish our bona fides that we're thinking big. We sort of think that we're going to come to the conclusion that it's not worth doing, but this is the stuff that maybe the CRI could step out of the comfort box of academia at a risk. So that's...
Zach?
A couple responses to that. I certainly do not I hope that CRI does not get into the debate of, is it 3 feet or is it something more scientific? I mean, that will end the value of CRI, in my opinion. But I think the 3 feet is significant because hopefully one of the things these 3 institutions can do, coming together with the policymakers and some business people, is think about the ways to communicate this in an effective way. Now, having said that, that's not always what the universities are about. And their economic model may not even be aimed at that. So one of the things that Andy talked about, we talked about at our table, is thinking of some ways to shift that model, not for all universities, not throughout these 3 universities, but for this institute. And Keith Gill has pointed out that one segment of some of the universities that tend to think about communication, because it is built into, or was built into their motivation, was the land-grant colleges, the agricultural forestry work, where the goal was to reach out to the people doing that. So hopefully the people involved in CRI, involved in reaching out to the policy people, can think about some of the things that will motivate that. And I do think it's significant in that regard that Mike McCarthy from the state was our speaker, because funding is going to make the difference.
We have time for a couple of responses from the audience, and then we can send, yes. Where did that microphone go? Okay.
The comment about breaking things, I thought that, is it on? A red light now.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, I thought the comment about breaking things into digestible chunks, time-wise, was very astute. And what it does, I mean, recognizing that sea level rise is going to continue for centuries, regardless of what we do with respect to mitigation, unlike some other things that might be affected more quickly, says that that's fine to get started, but you're going to have a sequence of chunks. So you really have to be thinking in terms of adaptive strategies, where you say, let's get started on the things that we know we need to face soon, and let's take a checkpoint and update the science and decide on the next chunk, and just get into people's mind that type of process.
Comment in the back here. I can run that back there.
Thank you. I agree with the last comment, and I think that the decision that has to be made by CRI is, to what extent does it want to respond to the comment the other gentleman made about establishing credibility and raising the level of urgency? I personally don't think that's a high priority for us in the Bay Area. I think everybody gets it. And maybe it's because I deal with other localities in Florida and Texas and Arizona that's a bit of a bigger hill to climb. I think the need here is actually to figure out how to do the sophisticated advising of decision makers who are getting ready to spend billions of dollars on adaptation with their engineers, their debt managers, and their senior management in the room, and their outreach and communications professionals, because all this has to be sold to the taxpayers or the ratepayers, depending on what kind of entity you are. And that requires sophistication. So I guess I don't agree with the position at this table that we should, what I heard, and maybe I heard it incorrectly, that we shouldn't try to understand and present uncertainty because people can't handle it. They have to be able to handle it with climate science. I've been working on this with in the water business for 7 or 8 years, and it's hard, but it's non-discretionary. And so I think CRI, like other climate service operations, and we need a climate service operation here in the Bay Area very desperately, needs to grapple with the complexity, how to present it, how to make it digestible. And the answer that we came up in this table that Andy mentioned is co-production. But Andy only mentioned the physical and social scientists that are in the room when that conversation goes on. Also, we also need to include the decision makers. That's what co-production is. So when you have that conversation, then it's a hard slog, but it's, as I said, I think necessary, and what a CRI can help us do.
I think we need to wrap it up there and head off to lunch. Just to pull together some of the themes that I heard in this discussion at the tables was appetite for risk, how bold is going to be, and what the governance and economic model are, and a lot more. But thank you for your time. I'd like to thank the panelists again for their excellent contributions. And don't forget to fill out your sheets. If you haven't done so, please leave those here because those are valuable to CRI. And now we go across the street for lunch. You're going to collect? Okay. We're going to collect the sheets at the door.